So you want to be a bonsai apprentice. Let's talk about it. Almost every week I get dozens and dozens of emails from people all over the world saying that they want to become a bonsai apprentice in Japan. But what I don't think they realize is just what's involved with that process and how much energy and effort you as a person have to put into that to be successful at doing an apprenticeship, completing an apprenticeship, and then going out into the world as a bonsai professional. So I thought for this video we could take a look at that process through my own experiences here in Japan. So hopefully that'll give you a better sense of what it means to do an apprenticeship in Japan and then become a bonsai professional afterwards. So let's get into it. So the baseline requirement for completing a typical bonsai apprenticeship in Japan is 5 years. Now traditionally what happens is when you complete that 5 years, you'll give 6 months or a year or however long back to your teacher, sort of as a gift or a thank you for having allowed you to study at their nursery for so long. Now at that 5 year point, if your teacher decides that you're not at a level where he thinks that you can go out into the world and be a successful bonsai professional, he may require that you stay on longer than that. But baseline requirement is 5 years. Now typically at most nurseries here in Japan, when you reach that 5 year period and your teacher allows you to graduate, you'll receive certification from the Nippon Bonsai Association or the Japanese Bonsai Association, which basically is a certificate that says you've completed a full apprenticeship and now you can go out and work as a bonsai professional. Now not all nurseries are going to provide this certification to their apprentices, but that typically is what happens here with an apprenticeship. Every nursery operates slightly differently here in Japan, so I'll just speak for myself, having done an apprenticeship at Eisei-en here in Osaka under Fujikawa-san. Our typical workday here as an apprentice would start prior to 8 a.m. You'd come in, clean up the nursery, a lot of sweeping, a lot of toilet cleaning, cleaning up the teacups from the previous day. All of that would have to be done before 8 o'clock, at which point the day would actually begin. So when I first started my apprenticeship here, the basic tasks for the day had almost nothing to do with styling or design with bonsai. They had to do with the basic maintenance, weeding around the garden, menial tasks, watering, things like that. So for the first year that I was here, there wasn't a whole lot of hands-on with the trees necessarily. The idea is as you start your apprenticeship, you should build a rapport with your teacher that convinces your teacher that you're mature enough and that you're focused enough to actually get your hands on the trees. So don't expect to come to Japan and jump right into styling material. It's just not gonna happen no matter where you study. It's also incumbent upon you during those first few months that you're here, and really for the duration of your apprenticeship, to take it upon yourself to study, self-study. There's not a lot of verbalization here in an apprenticeship. It's just not something that's gonna happen. So don't expect your teacher to tell you to style the branch this way, to apply the wire that way, to water the trees this way. It's a lot of self-observation, self-study, reverse engineering. It's incumbent upon you as the apprentice to take that upon yourself and really focus down. In doing so, you'll build a rapport with your teacher, you'll build a baseline skill set that you can then build off of during the duration of your apprenticeship. Now, I don't think it does really any good to regale everyone with stories of the horrors of doing an apprenticeship and how difficult it was. Of course it's difficult. Of course it takes a lot of effort. Of course it takes a lot of focus. But what I would like to say is something about the romanticized vision that people have of doing an apprenticeship in Japan. It is not like that. Get that idea out of your head. What ends up happening with most people is that they have this romantic idea of what's going to happen when they come to Japan. They come here, first year, they work really hard, they study, they're enjoying it. And then over time, the cultural differences start to bog them down, the amount of workload starts to bog them down, and over time, they just lose interest altogether. And within a year to 2 years, they've gone back to their home country. It takes a certain kind of person to get through those first 2 years, power through them, and then continue on to the end of the apprenticeship. But you really have to set those ideas aside and focus down on really why you came here, and that's to learn bonsai at the absolute highest level. Having come from the States, one of the biggest differences I think between the US and Japan, and really the West at large in Japan, is just how many people are crammed in a small space here and just how that affects the way that people interact with one another. There's this saying about Japanese building a wall, a personal bubble around themselves in which to exist, and really you have to do that here because there are so many people everywhere in the country. So coming here from a Western perspective, building that wall around yourself while at the same time trying to endear yourself to the Japanese community and particularly to the bonsai community It's a difficult thing to do, but it's absolutely necessary in completing a successful bonsai apprenticeship here. I think another big difference too is this idea of power distance here in Japan. So in the West, particularly in the United States, there's this idea that no matter where you are in the hierarchy, say in a company as a low-level employee versus the president of the company, everybody is essentially on the same playing field as a human being. Here in Japan, there's a massive power distance between people who are low-level employees and people who are higher up in the company. The same thing applies for the hierarchical structure of an apprenticeship. So someone coming in as a new apprentice is considered the absolute lowest in terms of ranking. They're considered the bottom kohai. And above that, you may have 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 senpai, or people who are your superiors in that ranking. And at the very highest level, you'll have your oyakata, who is your teacher or your master during the apprenticeship. There's almost a militaristic kind of approach to that relationship here, in that whatever your senpai or whatever your oyakata says, you respond hi or yes to. That's it. There's no questions about it. And I think that's one of the most difficult things to understand coming into an apprenticeship here. If your oyakata or your senpai says that the sky is purple, you say, hi, yes, I understand. And that's the end of the discussion. Now, does that mean you can't have a good relationship with your oyakata or your senpai? Absolutely not. So here at Eisei-en, we do have that hierarchical structure, of course, set up, but Fujikawa-san and I have a very friendly relationship. I have a very friendly relationship with Mayoka-san, who's my kohai here, and all down the line. So that type of cultural difference doesn't preclude one from setting up positive relationships within that hierarchical structure, but it takes time to get to that point. So don't come here expecting to be best friends with everyone else in the nursery. It's not going to happen. It doesn't work that way. Life in Japan in general can be a lot of fun, and it can be very irritating at times. It's the same no matter where you live in the world, but it takes a certain type of person to power through those irritating situations and really understand the overall context in which you're living here. It's quite difficult here sometimes to become part of the larger social community, even outside of the bonsai community. But some of the ways that one does that is by learning the language, really trying to immerse yourself in the culture here, understand that there's going to be differences, figuring out why people act a certain way and how you can respond positively to those situations. The living situation will obviously differ from nursery to nursery as well. So in my case, as an apprentice here at Eisei-en, I lived in an apartment not far from the nursery. I lived by myself. There was nobody else here. I was actually the only apprentice when I started here, so I had the apartment all to myself, and I would commute in every day to the nursery. It was only maybe a 3-minute bike ride from the shop. Some nurseries will have their apprentices stay on property, but here at Eisei-en it's slightly different. So now that I've graduated and I'm working as a bonsai professional, I have my own apartment different from the original one that I lived in as an apprentice, and that one's about 15 minutes away by bike. I live there with my wife, and I commute into the nursery every day. Apartments here in Japan tend to be very small, very cramped, and the doors tend to be quite low. Now for me, it's a big problem because I'm 2 meters tall. I'm about 6'6". So anywhere I go in Japan, the doors are going to be too low. But even for your average person, I think the living quarters here are going to feel very cramped, very small. And that's another thing that you'll have to adjust to. I think the responsible thing to do before starting an apprenticeship in Japan is to learn the language. You can do that any number of ways. You can audit courses at a university, you can enroll in those classes at a university or a separate private school, but at least take some time to learn the language. You're not really going to get the full experience here, the full immersion here, if you don't focus down on the language. And it's not an easy language to learn. Now, the spoken part of Japanese isn't that difficult. I think most people can handle that. It's the reading and writing that's a bit more difficult, and you're not going to need much of that while you do an apprenticeship. But still, it's good to have that baseline understanding when you come here. Now, some of the teachers here may speak English, but I guarantee you're going to have a fuller, more in-depth, broader experience if you learn the language before you come. I've been in Japan for almost 9 years now, and even today I still struggle on a day-to-day basis with the language. Some days I forget words, some days I don't know the grammar context or the larger context of a conversation and I get lost. But those things are going to happen. You have to power through them. It's just part of it. But if you really don't hammer down on the language and learn it, you're not going to have that deeper experience that I think is necessary in completing an apprenticeship and then going out into the world as a professional. As an apprentice, more than likely what's going to happen is that you'll have your room and board covered. So here at Eisei-en, when I was an apprentice, I had my apartment paid for by Fujikawa-san, and I received about $500 a month for food, which if you budget properly, you can live off of that. It's difficult to do because living expenses here are slightly high, but you can pull it off as long as you focus down and try to budget properly. The The last thing I want to say is that despite the fact that an apprenticeship is difficult and there are a lot of things that are going to pop up during the course of the apprenticeship that will really challenge you as a person, the overall idea is not necessarily just to learn about bonsai, but it's to figure out who you are as a person, to really delve deep into yourself and to look at yourself objectively from the outside as well. And that's something that I really discovered during the course of my time here in Japan. Sure, you can come here with an open mind about learning bonsai and about really training yourself again from the ground up. But beyond that, or more important than that, I think that discovering oneself here is really the point of doing an apprenticeship. And now that I've completed my apprenticeship and I'm working as a bonsai professional, what I've realized is that the work doesn't stop upon graduation. In fact, it gets more difficult. So an apprenticeship really is the setup for your career as a bonsai professional. It's challenging, it continues to be challenging, but within that I think lies the true fun and the enjoyment of bonsai. So I hope that this video provides you a little bit of context into what it's like to work in Japan as an apprentice and as a professional, and I look forward to meeting you guys in person in the future and answering more of your questions. In the meantime though, if you'd like, you could put some questions down below in the comment section and I'll answer those in a future video. So we'll see you guys next time.